So this is the fourth year I've presented this session, and each year I come to it and about 10 minutes before scratch my head to work out what's changed since the last year and what's different out there in the marketplace as part of it. Now this year, I think it's that general theme of continued awareness and consciousness in the marketplace in terms of how we're setting terms together and term sheets. Over the last year, we've been working with a number of different firms within the legal industry to try and then set out a new standard for the model template term sheet as part of it. And we are pleased to say we're almost there. We've got feedback from 5 different law firms around the different sets of documents that also underpin those, and those should be coming out shortly. What I'm going to do now is actually probably just run through some of the key elements of that and how they're changing and what to look out for as part of the equation. Now, no sooner we've almost landed these, I think we almost need to do a revision after Randy's chat today. We're no longer going to be referred to as investors. We're going to be effectively chief talent manager within the company, somewhere dealt into the organisation chart and dealt into the ESOP scheme. But I think following on from that, there was a lot of sage wisdom in Randy's words around trying to manage a thoroughbred, and certainly from the founders that I've worked with over the years and worked with them from very early stage right through to exits and go and do great things, thoroughbred is how I would describe quite a number of them, because they were absolutely phenomenal people, incredibly passionate but also well-rounded, but also knew when to jump the fence and when to just run at the fence for a bit to scare everyone, to let them know that they're still a little bit crazy, but actually turn away and actually take the advice of what's around them. So in that theme and in that, I guess, approach, the way I'd describe our term sheets traditionally, a step back 10 years, was actually trying to tie down the thoroughbred and try and make sure the thoroughbred didn't escape and try to make sure they corralled them down one straight road across the paddock to go into the greener pastures as such. The term sheets now are getting a bit more wider in terms of their view of the world and letting the thoroughbred run, but with checkpoints around where you go and check in with them. So with that, I'll now dive into some actual detail in terms of how we've broken things down and approached things. So we've really tried to get people thinking about things in the context of effectively investment terms, your investment conditions, your governance, and your key people arrangements, and broken them down under those headings so that actually you're following a logical sequence of thought, but also logical sequence of conversation with your founders in terms of setting these term sheets. What we're trying to do by doing that is to stop getting people to sleepwalk through term sheets, and effectively so many times term sheets land on our desk with absolutely no options selected in them other than putting the company's name in it, the amount of investment and the pre-money valuation, and a cap table that's wrong in the back. And we get told to document the deal. What we're trying to do is actually use it as a talking piece for investors and founders to step through together to actually check on alignment. Are they going to get to the destination broadly in the same way as part of it? We've also tried to include some notes and say, this is why we've got this clause and this is why it's important. Don't just select the default, this is the best for the investor setting. Actually have a conversation about it, talk about it, because actually when we talk about term sheets, it's all about context. You know, each company is wildly different, and Lee and I were talking actually over lunch, and the reality is usually these days it boils down to about 5 different points that you sort of negotiate with at any great length when you're doing a term sheet. The hard thing is actually getting that to fit right for the company and getting those settings to fit right with the company, which is where, from an advisor's perspective, I think the marketplace has also grown up in terms of people being aware of the terms out there and what they're used for. So this term sheet's designed to try and help you navigate through that process. Some examples of that, looking at ESOP. And so instead of before we used to have ESOP tucked away somewhere in the bottom of the term sheet, which everyone forget, we're actually now calling it out as a separate section, so you can actually call out the percentage, whether it's the pre-investment capitalisation or the post-investment capitalisation, who will be a participant in it. So again, you can have those conversations up front as opposed to lobbing it over the fence and then lawyers having conversation, because that's not a win situation for anyone. We don't know. Yep.
Hey Bruno, can you do a quick dive into ESOP just on that, so specifically the pre and the post and how it's allocated?
Sure. So
Maybe you can example.
absolutely, yeah. So ESOP is an employee share option plan. We're mostly seeing options out there these days. Whether it's pre or post money is how you calculate the size of it. So whether you're actually going to be done on if you've got 100 shares on issue and it's 10% pre, 10% of 10 of those 100 shares should be allocated towards the ESOP. And then it's a question of who gets diluted by it. So do you pre-bake in and say if the company's worth $1,000 and you've got 100 shares, do you actually, is it $10 a share for your issue price, or actually is it $1,000 divided by 90 shares to work out your issue price as such? So that's when we talk about whether it's pre-capitalisation, post-capitalisation. They are very basic formulas. We are lawyers, we can get them, so most people should be able to get them out there. But it's more about understanding the effect of them. Now, where you draw the line as to who takes the dilution or not is a separate context conversation. Again, I think we were talking in the break, just around percentages, typical percentages we see.
Yeah, I mean, I think in New Zealand, it's probably at early stage, probably between 5 and 10% as you get it through a pre-Series A round. You might be looking at more like 10 to 15%, and then it can get up to almost 20%. I think the difference we were talking about is overseas. I think investors see ESOP slightly differently. It's really about getting in, new hires and attracting talent. I think in New Zealand, because we've typically had lower valuations, the ESOPs have been used to top up founders when they've had too much dilution in early rounds, when they've not been able to attract that substantial follow-on round. So that's probably explains why we do see ESOP pools, which are maybe a little bit larger than you might see in overseas startups.
And how did you find it, Dana, going into Exhibit? In terms of what did they have did they have anything in place at the time?
Oh, yeah.
And what have you gone to?
Yeah, we have 12.5% in the Exhibit for the last round we did, but it was not used for topping up founders. It was more used for key employees and board compensation. And the conversation is evolving around ESOP because it's not a topic that you can go and have a lot of best practices around. So you sort of add your own stake in the ground, and then you contribute to the general collective exchange as to whether it worked or not. And for example, we were concerned whether it made sense to distribute the entire ESOP before the next round, or if it was good practice and seen as prudent and conservative from the next investor to have still quite a bit of ESOP on hand, because we weren't, because we were frugal with it rather than just, we have it, let's just give it away. So those types of flavors of how you handle discretionary shares and shares based on, and whether you dish it out based on milestones and other things, and then if it can come back to you if you have a bad lever clause and so on. So it's a critical, and the conversation, like I said, it keeps evolving, and it's great to see it highlighted in the term sheet in its own section, because it brings it to the forefront of
very much so, because it's a massive part of capital strategy. Overall. And usually if you're using it for founders, you've screwed up your capital strategy somewhere along the line.
But I want to say, like, when we raised for the Exhibit and a couple of other companies I was involved with, it was the last thing that the investors were thinking about, and we could have easily added another 10% on it. Because if the interest is there and if the deal is hot and everyone wants to come in, no one's going to object to your 15 or 20%.
It's also the lawyer's cheekiest way to play around the pre-money valuation effectively as to who gets hit by the dilution when you're trying to bridge.
Yeah. Completely.
The other thing on ESOPs, I mean, the term sheet won't bring this out because it'll probably just say the company needs to implement an ESOP post-round, but ESOPs across the world have very different terms. The general principle is that once you've earned the shares and then there's a liquidity event, there may be is full acceleration of those unvested options. so that the people who have been there, been on the journey, get the upside. In the US, much different approach. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but they'd have a sort of double trigger acceleration, which basically means that people have to stick around for another 12 months, and they'd only get that acceleration if they were dismissed as part of the acquisition. I see people thinking about those kind of concepts here, because if you're a buyer and you know that everyone's going to get upside from acceleration under the ESOP, they're all going to be out the door, and they're the very people that you want to stick around if you've just acquired a company.
Very good. So the other things we are focusing on include just, again, that capital management around your pre-money valuation and how does dilution play out into it. So whereas previously we'd sort of always called out what is the issue price and what typically most people would put in there as $1 a share and then create a rod for their own back because they told their shareholders it was $1 a share. Then actually when they did all their calculations around all the options they had on issue and the warrants and the ESOP and stuff like that, it actually turned out to be 92 cents a share. We've tried to strip away from that, recognising that a lot of the time when you're doing the term sheet stage, the cap table still hasn't fully settled. In terms of just clearing out some old loans, conversion of convertible loans and things like that. So now we just sort of say, what's your pre-money and how you're treating it from a dilution perspective as such. And then ultimately, the issue price will be a derivative calculation from there to try and stop people from boxing themselves into positions and getting entrenched completely erroneously on and fixated on an issue price rather than actually what is the aggregate deal here? Sorry, you meant to have another question. And the other big thing we're really focused on, I guess, is vesting. So all of these sort of largely feed into capital strategy and trying to get the most out of the company as such, but also making sure you're having that three-way conversation between the company, four-way really, the company, the investors, the founders, and the founders as among themselves as well as to how vesting is going to work as such, so that in that concept, if one of the founders doesn't hang around, you've got a pool of shares that you can zap back for relatively minimal cost and then redeploy that into an ESOP to go and bring somebody new into the mix to drive the company forward, knowing how critical is, everything we've talked about today is about team, and if you can't incentivize that team member, even if that person wasn't the first person on the journey, it's a pretty pointless vehicle to be in. So we're seeing that a lot more.
Can you talk, and maybe there's an example, practically vesting, so what happens? I've got 20% as a founder, investors come in,
Sure.
I'll leave the next day, what do I get?
You're a savvy guy, you've done an investment round, your first angel round, you've still got 80% of the shares. It's then saying, well, actually, okay, Robbie, we really want you around for the next 3 years, so actually, to keep 80% of the shares or keep all of your shares, you need to actually hang around for the next 3 years. But if you leave before then, we're going to take some of those shares back and we're going to take them back for nicks, basically. Now, actually...
I wouldn't keep him hanging around for 3 years.
Yeah. Well, that's right.
I mean, not on the basis just 3 years. He'd have to have some milestones. Like, he'd have to keep delivering.
Yeah. And it's around being in the company and being active in the company as such and contributing to the company. Now, I think John's criticism of us when we first released a bit of a preview of the term sheet was we actually just put little dots in there in terms of what percentages should Robbie have to give up of his shares should he leave early. It's really, again, around the context as such. We were talking about it in the break. Generally, we don't see more than, say, 50% of your shares going into that regime. So, 40 of your shares would have been at risk now for the next 3 years. Then we'd also usually see them structured at, once you've been around there for a year, you'd get somewhere between 25 to 35% of those shares back off the table again and out of risk, and they're in your back pocket. They can't take them back off you.
Just on vesting, I think context is really important because I think it's one area where founders get really sensitive about it, because if you've worked in a business for 5 years and suddenly investors are coming in and saying, well, actually we want to subject half of your shares to vesting, they can get quite upset about that. So I think you have to look carefully as investors as to how much of that of their shares are up to vesting in the first place, and also what the period is. And I think it also depends on whether they're a sole founder or as a team, because again, you might feel a little bit more precious about that if you're kind of the sole founder and you've been running the business for 3 or 4 years.
Brian, down the back.
I know entrepreneurs that'll just say no to that.
Yeah.
I actually view it as a very dangerous thing. You'll demotivate entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
I actually think it's quite a predatory practice. I've
well,
been an entrepreneur and I'm now an investor. So as legal advisors, if you're talking to the entrepreneurs, I'd ask you that you recommend they put a big red line through that as part of their negotiation, although I think it's bad. I have a question. In the US, we had ordinary shares, non-voting, and they were basically penny shares, which really helped fight liquidation preference and a few other things. Why in New Zealand do we only have one value, and it's the value that the preference shareholder came in with the last money? It doesn't seem to make sense relative to the US model.
That's something, certainly, so when you're striking on the option and what the actual fair market value is, I think there's something you'll see a lot more in New Zealand in the context, but also what you also have in the US context is participating preference stacks on top, which does actually push that value of the ordinary shares, regardless of voting or not, right down, or the common stock right down.
Yep.
I have seen valuations over here where valuation firms have done different valuations attributable to different classes as such, given where the preference stack was for that company at that point in time. So it's not off the table here. IRD didn't pick up on it. I wasn't about to put my hand up and sort of say, hey guys, you haven't really thought about this, because the next conversation with that is, and you can only issue your shares, your options for fair market value, which is the same as the US regime as well. So it's sort of, that's where we're slightly different.
I think if you're going to come out with a term sheet template, it should represent the entrepreneurs 50-50 with the investors, because it will become a template for the industry. For the investors to have a template and just force it by default onto entrepreneurs and say this is the template, I think that's imbalanced leverage, particularly
it is very
from
much a balanced template compared to what has traditionally gone in the past.
I'd argue if you're putting options on founders' shares, it's not a balanced template.
Just to jump in there, with Simmons Stewart, we've contributed to the term sheet discussions, and probably there's been no law firm in New Zealand that's represented founders and companies for the last 5 years more than Simmons Stewart. In fact, over the years, we've been critical of template documents presented by investors. So we have had some input on that. Just on the vesting point, I agree with you in some respects. Vesting can be a bit harsh on people that have been working in a business. Having said that, we recommend most of our founders have vesting arrangements as between themselves, because vesting is actually not just an issue between investor and founder. It's actually an issue between the founders themselves, because if I've met up with a guy through an accelerator program and I've given up my day job, and another guy comes in and takes 30% of the company, and then he disappears to the UK because he's got personal circumstances, then I'd quite like those shares back myself. So actually vesting is a key aspect as amongst the founders. Our recommendation and preference would always be that the founders themselves agree it, and then that is presented to the investors, and the investors don't present that as part of a term sheet. But I accept in life you can't have everything, and so you have to deal with what you're presented.
And it's a completely contextual conversation, and I can understand it also from the US perspective, where it's a lot easier to dismiss somebody and get somebody out to trigger the vesting as part of it. So New Zealand, that's a lot more difficult as part of it as well. So there's some cultural differences that we see. I can certainly appreciate there is scope for investors to try and leverage their position from it. Most of what we see, people actually want the founders still around, and it's more around actually has the venture outgrown them, and do we need to somehow try and rebalance to bring people through? And it's usually a grown-up conversation.
But Bruno, how many instances have we had vesting invoked?
How many have I seen it invoked?
Yeah. On percentage?
I would say, I'm guessing out of a sample pool of plus 50 companies, maybe 2.
Yeah, so it remains still an exception.
Well, I think
There was a question. Sorry.
Just one point actually to echo the sentiment here from an investor point of view. I think certainly at Punakaki Fund, but my own personal view is that investor founding is counter to what you want to be encouraging from founders. Like from an investor point of view, I think you're right. It is quite predatory. It's very harsh, and also as investors, you want your founders to continue to remain in the business for the right reasons, not because they're worried about their shares vesting. So if actually they're only there because of some sort of artificial means, i.e. this a vesting term, you don't really want them in the business anyway, right?
John?
Great conversation, obviously, what we're interested in. I think the context for it is quite important. The problem it's trying to solve is we have a founding team, and I've had first-hand experience of this on several occasions. One or two of that team leave, right? So then you've got 2 people out of 3 who aren't involved in the operation of the business, have been in there a very short period of time. In 2 cases I can think of, now live offshore, having a lifestyle, and the company then has to replace those two people. Where do they get the equity from to incentivise the replacement?
You issue more shares to everybody except the people that are
Hang
taking
on,
them.
let me finish. This doesn't benefit the investors because the shares are held by the company and used to incentivise the replacement. So I've had first-hand experience of having to deal with it when those people have gone twice without having vesting, and it's been very problematic. One case just about brought the company to its knees. And I've also had the experience with Arsenal, a successful company, SaaS company, where the founders were agreeable to it because they could see the benefit in it. So I think it's a thing of balance. It's not designed for one side to be predatory over the other, but it is an important issue to have a conversation about. And I think, as Bruno said, a lot of these points in the term sheet are really to force that discussion up front so that it's not entered into lightly and then there's a train smash afterwards.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think it's about incentivizing people. The principle of vesting is getting people to stick around, and so we don't have the situation you just described. So as long as everyone's entering into the term on that basis, then all good. So it's a bit like founder liability on reps and warranties. What is the minimum amount that makes the founders take the disclosure process seriously, but doesn't make them they can't sleep at night because it's personal liability? Similar kind of thing with vesting. What is the smallest percentage that makes it interesting enough for them not to walk out and make it fair for the rest of the founders who, as you say, I mean, this can bring down companies. That's not an exaggeration if someone with 25% of the company goes offshore. The one thing I will say is on vesting is what investors shouldn't do is that they shouldn't put in punitive stuff on like bad lever so that they put a very expansive definition and effectively it's a tool by which they can measure someone on performance and claw back shares even if they might be vested. I think that is predatory behaviour and I don't think we're necessarily going to see that in the term sheet, but that's what I think founders would need to look for. I don't think it's unreasonable for founders to have some of their shares, small proportion, and the percentage is up for discussion, subject to some kind of vesting, because as I said, it protects the founders from their other founders. So I think it's not an unfair perspective, I think.
Yeah, and look, all of these terms, they are the default position if all goes wrong. The reality is it's not also the proxy position. We also find some people want to just jump to that as a proxy position going, that's my rights, give it to me. Actually, what we are seeing a lot more in markets now, and as also our companies mature and actually push in and hit that global stage, is actually having sensible, serious conversations about actually, did I screw up here? Did I screw up here? Where there's a bit of fault in between. How are we going to deal with it together as such? I was talking to Lee before as well and Dana in terms of I haven't seen a big, massive dust up in a company for a long while. Whereas I think you go step back 7-10 years ago and there used to be some pretty horrendous sort of publicly played out fights as such. I think as this marketplace matures, you're seeing a lot more applied thinking coming to the conversation and a lot more maturity from the investor director side. Also, you're seeing a lot more maturity from the founder side as they're more aware of what's part of it. I guess the purpose of the term sheet in a lot of ways is to try and stop people sleepwalking through that process and actually really put some real value on what it's doing, and it's allocating the stewardship of the company and the capital structure of the company through a bunch of different mechanisms. And how much do you really value capital. Like one of my tests, if I'm on an investor, and this is not me as a lawyer, this is me personally, is like seeing how people respond to having pressure put on them around capital and how it may play out, and how much they value that. You can see, I see plenty of sort of founders who just go, oh, well, that person's been along for a ride, I'm just going to chuck some equity their way. I was like, well, just wait. That's actually got real value. How much do you really value it, and how much are you really thinking forward in the value of that equity as such? So the term sheet's there to try and stimulate that discussion rather than people just going, I've agreed to pre-money, I've agreed an amount I'm going to invest, and that's pretty much the critical elements of the deal, and let's jump into it and have some fun and see how things go.
I'd like to echo John's comments. I mean, although I think it's really predatory to take a company that's 4 years old and say suddenly you don't own your shares anymore. I think that's terrible, right?
Yeah.
But I was thinking more of the accelerator companies, the Lightning Lab companies, which will put together a team of 3, 4, 5 people. They know work together before. It's the first time they come into business. They get funding, and within 3 or 4 months, someone decides, well, I can't live on this, pittance, and I can go and get a real job and earn a lot more money, and I've still got my shares. Yeah. So the vesting for Lightning Lab or accelerator-based businesses, to me, is you have to have it.
And a whole bunch of this is context, right? Yeah. If this has been your business for 60 days, the last 90 days, then actually it may well be appropriate. If you've been in the business and you've sold your house and you've pumped cash into it and you've been at it for 4 years, then actually, there can be other mechanisms.
If I was that founder, I'd be reacting against it, and you wouldn't get any of my shares, right?
Yeah.
But as a startup, a true startup that's with a bunch of people who are trying to create a new business, to me, you have to have it. It's got to be there in place.
Sorry, it was Dave.
Do ANZ have a position on the new template?
They've been involved in the process, but largely like any other investor in the market, really. So there's no NZ Vifisms left in it, for want of a better expression. So it's very much, this template can be used in any sort of situation as such. We've been sort of just trialling it in just different deals as such, and it's sort of ironing some kinks out of it and stuff. But yeah, it's meant to work for all types of situations. So the other thing we've also found, probably in the marketplace as well, is, and it's been pointed out today, is we don't have that middle tier of capital coming through, is actually some of these terms, while they may be there and the hard edges of them may be there in the first round, what we are now starting to see as well, as some of these angel companies go out for a 1 or 2 million raise from other angels and new angels as part of it, is a lot of these terms are being knocked out as part of it, which is all about trust, right? The terms were in there in the first place in the absence of trust to try and build a framework for people to jump in to the same vehicle together. That trust is then formed, and we're usually finding those in those highly trusted companies, the terms are changing quite markedly, quite quickly once revenue starts to flow and people have worked together for a while and actually see how people respond under pressure.
So specifically, which Vifisms have gone?
So your co-sale rights, what else used to be there? The reporting's been dialed back down. What else is there? Even the ineligible business not there. Any dilutes are in there on a broad-based weighted average basis, which if you actually do the sums on them, is pretty modest in terms of the outcome it creates if they're fired. Again, if people can understand them, and then if they are fired, it's a relatively modest outcome as such. Some of the things we've been doing with the Angel Association, modelling through some of that stuff so people actually understand what the difference between a narrow and a broad-based weighted average anti-dilute is versus the full ratchet. Like I don't think I've seen a deal full ratchet for quite a number of years as part of it. And even the argument between broad and narrow, people just give up and just actually going broad, and it's time bound after 2 years type stuff.
So thank you very much, guys.
Cheers.
Round of applause. Yeah.